Okay, picking up Duane Gish's description of this process here with Dubois. He says, Dubois exhibited these fossils at the International Congress of Zoology in Leiden in 1895. Authorities greeted Dubois' announcement with considerable skepticism and divided opinion. British zoologists, that's zoologists, by the way, I'm kind of half pronouncing that incorrectly, I got to get that right. British zoologists tended to view the remains as human. The Germans tended to view them as those of an ape, and the French as those of something between ape and man. Dubois failed to reveal that he'd also discovered at nearby Wadjak, that's W-A-D-J-A-K, and approximately the same level, 2 human skulls known as the Wadjak skulls, with a cranial capacity of about 1,550 to 1,650 cubic centimeters. Okay? Now, he's found at the same level in the same general area, though a different spot, the skulls that are absolutely human. And the cranial capacity of those human skulls is somewhat above the present human average. To have revealed this fact, that he found these 2 human skulls, at that time would have rendered it difficult, if not impossible, for his Java man to have been accepted as a missing link. So he didn't tell about it. It was not until 1922, which is 31 years later, when a similar discovery was about to be announced, that Dubois announced the fact that he had possessed the Wadjak skulls for over 30 years. His failure to reveal this find to the scientific world at the same time he exhibited the Pithecanthropus specimens was deplorable, since this constituted concealment of important evidence. One evolutionist anthropologist excused it by stating that it would have been too much of a meal for most anthropologists to digest if the human skulls had been exhibited along with this Pithecanthropus erectus. So, they just couldn't have taken it. Gish concludes the following: about 15 years before his death, and after most evolutionists had become convinced of the man-like status of Pithecanthropus, Dubois himself dealt the unkindest blow of all. He changed his mind and declared that it was nothing more than a giant gibbon.
Your gibbon?
Yeah, right. There's a guy by the name of now gone, but a guy by the name of Marcellin Boulay, I believe it's pronounced, he's French. He was then director of the French Institute of Human Paleontology and one of the world's foremost experts on human fossils, and H.V. Valois, Boulay's successor, stated in their 1957 book called Fossil Men the following: following Dubois, several naturalists have laid stress on the resemblance between the Pithecanthropus remains and the corresponding portions of Gibbon's skeleton. In that case, why not assume that Pithecanthropus represents a large form, a giant ape related to the Gibbon group? Now, these are evolutionists that are making the obvious conclusion. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, swims like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it looks like a giant ape and a gibbon, it probably is. They go on, following a discussion in their book of many features of the skull cap. Boulay and Valois remark in the following way. They said this: taken as a whole, these structures are very similar to those of chimpanzees and gibbons. They report that von Koenigswald, a German paleontologist, also spent time in Java and discovered some additional material attributed the 2 molar teeth that Dubois discovered to an orangutan and premolar tooth. And, let me read that again to get it right. He attributed the 2 molar teeth that Dubois discovered to an orangutan and the premolar tooth to a true man. So they had some of each. And Gish then goes on in following the story. He says, in 1906 expedition at the exact site of Dubois' excavation failed to produce a single scrap of material, although 10,000 cubic yards of soil were removed. During 1936 to 1939, G.H.R. von Königswald carried out an extensive search at Sangaran, about 40 miles from Tranil. His efforts were rewarded by the discovery of fragments of jaw bones, including teeth, fragments of skulls, and a skull cap. No limb bones were found. Von Königswald labeled his finds Pithecanthropus 2, 3, and 4. Boulay and Valois report that the skulls found at Sangaran present the same general character as Dubois' Pithecanthropus. In the case of the Sangaran finds, several teeth were intact in the mandible. This is the later discovery now by Königswald. They had a mandible with teeth intact in it. Every characteristic of these teeth given by Boulay and Valois is simian rather than man-like. Simian is ape. In their book Fossil Men, Boulay and Valois, commenting on this, said this: "The true molars are extremely large and increase in size from the first to the third, a simian feature that does not occur in humans. The point of the canine rises above the biting surface of the premolars, another simian character only found in man in the fossil jaw from Wajak. No less important is the presence of a diastema or group between the upper canine and the lateral incisor of 5 millimeters on the right and 6.2 millimeters on the left." By the way, there's a lot of details here. Don't worry about them. Just get the drift of what he's going for. In about 50% of cases, the diastema is no longer in anthropoids. Anthropoids are ape creatures, just apes, okay? This feature, which proves that the lower canine must have been particularly highly developed, has never been encountered in the genus Homo. Again, Homo would be, once you shift over into what they're classifying as at least part man. And by the way, let me just say this right now in case it doesn't fit in someplace else. All of the so-called prehistoric men have all been reclassified today as either apes or men. Nothing in between. Even though in each discovery they've been labeled as some kind of a link, some of each, somewhere between the two, they've all been reclassified. So you either have things that used to be links that are no longer links, they're just apes, or you got things that used to be links that are no longer links, they're just man. Yeah.
Now, are you saying that this reclassification is common knowledge throughout the public space?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm glad you raised that point. For the most part, you're still getting, well, for example, I just read about Java Man from the encyclopedia. And how did they portray it? They didn't portray him as an ape. They portrayed him as a man-like creature that had ape characteristics. Okay? Or an ape-like creature with man characteristics. And the school books, I'm certain, are still carrying that kind of propaganda. And they're not teaching that in the schools. But the people out there in the field that are serious researchers in this area know the truth. And know that there are none that are any kind of evidence of a mixture. It's either human or ape. Boulay and Valois continued in their book and said this: "To these characteristics may be added the fact that the upper premolars and true molars are arranged almost in a straight line, so that the form of the palate is more reminiscent of the U-shaped palate of the anthropoids, of the apes, than of the horseshoe-shaped human palate. All these facts provide singularly unambiguous confirmation of those that emerged from a study of the cranium." Okay, now, by the way, that's another point here that they allude to. The way the teeth are lined up in the jaw of an ape is they're basically straight and parallel, the back teeth, until you come to the front teeth where they curve around into the U. Where the human jaw is, there's a kind of an angle to it. They angle out from the front teeth slightly, okay, as opposed to just a straight U-shaped. Concerning the Java Man skulls, a man by the name of Joseph Birdsell points out that the basal portion was removed in a way that suggests that the apes were killed by a human for the purpose of eating the brain. So the quote-unquote fossil remains that they found of these skulls, they were all broken. And remember, there was virtually no straight bones, no leg bones or anything like that found, just skulls, except for that stray bone brought in from someplace else. That it appears that whatever these creatures were, the heads were taken and broken open to get at the brains. He reported that in an article called Human Evolution, the Introduction to the New Physical Anthropology. The 1957 Encyclopedia Britannica said, with respect to Java Man, additional evidence must be presented before a reliable hypothesis can be constructed. And that's many, many, many years after the fact. 60 plus years after the fact. Now let's talk about Peking Man. Peking Man was designated scientifically Sinanthropus pekinensis. I have trouble with some of these names. In 1927 was so designated, and in 1940 was designated Homo erectus. So they changed it to Homo erectus. Peking Man is another widely publicized so-called missing link. Let me read again now first from the World Book Encyclopedia's description of the Peking Man before I give you the other evidence. The World Book says, Peking Man was a type of prehistoric man who lived about 375,000 years ago in what is now modern China. Scientists named him Sinanthropus pekinensis, meaning Chinese man of Peking. He belonged to a species of primitive human beings called Homo erectus, or erect man. In the 1920s, Davidson Black, a Canadian anatomy professor, identified fossils found near Peking, China, as remains of prehistoric human beings. Since then, scientists have found the partial remains of more than 30 of these prehistoric people, along with over 100,000 stone tools and countless animal bones, mainly deer. Now remember, I'm reading from the Encyclopedia Britannica. The fossils show that Peking Man stood about 5 foot 1 inch in height and had heavy bones. He apparently had big brow ridges, powerful jaws, large teeth, and a brain smaller than that of modern man. In 1941, most of the fossils disappeared while being shipped out of China. In 1963 and 64, scientists found similar fossils at Lantien, about 600 miles southwest of Peking. That's what the World Book has to say about Peking Man. Sounds like a genuine link, doesn't it? However, I'm going to read you now from Duane Gish, a description of this matter of Peking Man and the evidence. He said this in his book, Evolution, the Challenge of the Fossil Record. If one accepts uncritically the evidence usually presented in texts and treatises on Peking Man, the case for the existence of a near man or a man with many very primitive features would seem to be established. For example, the skull model and flesh reconstructions based on this model shown in Figure 20. I've got a copy of that for you here. In fact, please, I don't have enough for everybody, but kind of pass them around and share. This is a copy of Figure 20 he's alluding to here. I took out of his book. He says, for example, the skull model and flesh reconstructions based on this model shown in Figure 20 reveal a remarkable resemblance to modern man and could hardly be called less than human. So as you look at these pictures, you know, they, in spite of the kind of primitive look, it does look like a human being. And there's a lot of similarities in that skull to looking human as well. And I agree with that, by the way, that that's how it looks. He says a close examination of the reports, related to Peking Man, however, reveal a tangled web of contradictions, highly subjective treatment of the data, a peculiar and unnatural state of the fossil bones, and the loss of essentially all of the fossil material. Now, just look again at these pictures. These are models or reconstructions that were put together, we'll see later, by the successor to Black, the guy who discovered it in the first place, the guy that took over after Black died. His name is Weidenreich, and he put this together. But we'll read more about that a little bit later. But but you know what? I've seen people that look like that. So this must be human, or something like it, right? Well, we'll hold our thought on that and see as we go on. Okay, researchers have found what were actually ape-like remains, and this is going back to Black now, about 25 miles from Peking, China in the 1920s and 30s. The evidence that they found consisted of fragments of about 30 skulls and 147 teeth, but almost no limb bones, and anything that was found that was related to a limb were only highly fragmentary remains. They didn't even find a single whole limb. In only 5 cases were the skulls complete enough, not complete, but complete enough to determine even so much as brain capacity. One of the initial finds was a single tooth. So Black found initially was a single tooth, and without waiting for further evidence, Dr. Black declared that this tooth established evidence for the existence of an ancient man-like creature. After the discovery and description of these finds, the original bones were supposedly shipped to the United States during World War II in order to keep them out of the hands of the Japanese. Most of the bones mysteriously disappeared on the trip, with only a handful of bones in glass jars arriving in the United States. And the lost bones, quote-unquote, have never been recovered. It's not like after we won the war, we found out the Japanese had them. And there's no specific witnesses, not one witness saying, yeah, I saw the bones put on the ship, I was on the ship, and some bad guys came and stole them. I mean, there's nothing. They supposedly were being shipped over, and they just mysteriously disappeared.
I think they got knocked off the shelf and broke.
Just swept them away, yeah. I don't know why nobody ever thought of that before. Rather, in fact, some researchers have suggested that the mysterious, this would be creationist researchers, of course, have suggested that the mysterious disappearance of the bones of these apes and the concealment of the human remains at the site may have been a part of a cover-up by overzealous evolutionists trying to keep belief in Peking man alive. Others believe it was a twist of fate. Okay? Now, by the way, I just alluded to the fact that there were human remains also found at the general site. I haven't told you about that yet. Yeah.
Does that one man or doctor who found that one tooth,
Dr. Black,
does he get into a description of like the size of the tooth?
I don't have those details, but there are some comments about the tooth here as we go on. Okay, today all we have at all is the evidence that exists consists merely of casts of unproven accuracy and 2 teeth. In other words, they're mold things that they made up and said, yeah, this is what we found. This is what it looked like. Yeah, trust me. That's all they actually have. They don't have any actual physical evidence. So, therefore, Duane Gish said this, continuing quoting out of his book on the fossil record. He says, as a result, we are totally dependent on models and descriptions of this material left by a few investigators, all of whom were totally committed to the idea that man had evolved from animal ancestors. Even if a scientist is completely honest and as objective as humanly possible, the model or description he fashions on the basis of scanty and incomplete material will reflect to a critical degree what he thinks the evidence ought to show. Let me repeat that last line. He says, if a scientist is completely honest and as objective as humanly possible, the model or description he fashions on the basis of scanty and incomplete evidence. In other words, he didn't find a whole skeleton or a whole cranium. But he's got scanty evidence, so he says it will reflect to a critical degree what he thinks the evidence ought to show. Furthermore, he says there is ample evidence that objectivity was seriously lacking in the treatment and evaluation of the material recovered at Chukoutian. If the type of evidence we have today relating to Peking Man were brought into a court of law, it will be ruled as hearsay and inadmissible as evidence. Now, of the skulls, I said there were about 30 found parts of skulls, about 30 different skulls. One of the more complete skulls was number 11. They number these things. The evolutionists commissioned reconstructions from it named Nellie and brought it before the press to present it. But what people don't realize is that the human-like reconstructions were based on the following quality of evidence. The skull was badly broken and far from complete. The facial bones, which were combined with the rest of the skull, came from a few feet away, therefore may not actually belong to Nellie. The toothless lower jaw came from a part of the excavation 80 feet higher than the skull cap fragments. Now again, let me underline, when any of us and any of these people we're quoting that are raising critical remarks about the evidence, and they refer to different layers or the distances apart in feet, it's not significant to us per se. It's only significant in light of their belief system, the evolutionist belief system. You can't have their belief system and have the same creature 80 feet apart. You know, it just doesn't hold up. In our system, it could be the same creature, possibly. It would be fragmented and torn apart, perhaps, in the flood. But more importantly, it's probably not the same creature, but you could have creatures of the same relationship, you know, scattered all over the place, or you could have creatures of different quote-unquote descent in the same place because of the flood. So when these things are raised as points of criticism against their evidence, it's not because we believe that layer or area 80 feet deeper or more shallow, whichever the case may be, is actually representative of some vast period of time. But they believe that it is, and therefore it does not lend to their interpretation of the evidence. We quoted earlier from Boulay and Valois in their book Fossil Men, and here's a quote now from them in which they accused Dr. Black, the discoverer of the tooth, of a lack of objectivity and twisting the facts, and they said this about him. Quote, Black, who had felt justified in forging the term Sinanthropus to designate one tooth, was naturally concerned to legitimize his creation when he had to describe a skull cap. By the way, sometimes they'll take a tooth and they'll build an entire skull out of one tooth. And I mean, it is total. They build a whole community, that's right. Well, they start by building one skull cap, then they build an entire skeleton, then they build a whole community of skeletons. But anyway, he says, while acknowledging the great resemblance of this piece to the Javan or the Java man counterpart, he stressed the differences and demonstrated them by numerical data. Now, on studying his tables of measurements, it is quite evident that the differences observed between Pithecanthropus on the one hand and the various fragments of Sinanthropus on the other, far from possessing generic value, are less than the variations recorded within the very natural scientific group Homo neanderthalensis. In other words, you're saying Black is trying to portray this as a different creature from the previous one, Pithecanthropus, and yet the variations between Pithecanthropus findings and the Sinanthropus that he's labeled, the differences are even less than the differences within something that everybody acknowledges as a single group. So, in other words, what does it mean? Nothing. So, in other words, Black stuck his neck out on the basis of a single tooth, and he erected Sinanthropus, the Sinanthropus category around that single tooth, and he felt compelled to color the facts to fit his existing scheme. So, therefore, what confidence can you have in any of the descriptions or models of Sinanthropus from the hand or mouth of Dr. Black? There's no, I mean, even if you accept him as a reasonable scientist, even though he has an evolutionary point of view, if you could accept him as that, then you say, well, I trust the things he says about the facts. In this case, there's just too much evidence that you can't trust him at all, regardless of what you think about his point of view. Okay, there's also clear evidence found in the later time of the digs. You know, I said it was in the 20s and the 30s. When you get into the 30s, after Black was gone, of another creature that was found at this site that was not Sinanthropus. Guess what it was? True human beings. Fossils of true human beings were found who had been mining limestone at this location, who transported thousands of quartz stones to the site, which I assume had something to do with mining the limestone, and who left tools behind and built fires. Fossil remains of 10 humans were found at this site. Again, as Gish and others do, he can raise the question, well, if at the same site you find full human beings and these other things that are more ape-like, I say more ape-like in their view, or definitively ape, and they're all at the same site, how can one be an ancestor of the other? Okay, Black died in 1934, and Franz Weidenreich, an American paleontologist of German extraction, took charge of the investigation. And the models that we gave you or showed you there in that figure 20 that I passed around were fashioned by Weidenreich. But at best, the models are hearsay evidence. Because he says, oh yeah, this is what we found, but he has no something to substantiate it. So, okay, well, I made these models, but here's the actual bones that we made the models from. I mean, they're not there. They don't have them. So all researchers on both sides, creationists and evolutionists, agree about one thing about Peking man, and that is that he had been killed and eaten by hunters. Okay? Quoting
Ate the missing link.
Somebody ate the missing link, yeah. Now, here's a quote from Boulay and Valois that we've quoted a number of times before in their book Fossil Men. They said this: how are we to explain the almost complete absence of long bones and this kind of skeleton of bony parts, all belonging to the skull, in which lower jaws predominate? Weidenreich believed that these selected parts did not come into the cave by natural means, but that they must have been brought there by hunters who chiefly attacked young individuals and chose for preference the spoils as spoils or trophies, heads or parts of heads. In itself, this explanation is thoroughly plausible, Boulay and Valois say about Weidenreich's comments. Then they add one more sentence to this quote. But the problem is to name the hunter. Who's the hunter? Who did this? That's the question they raise. Now, the evidence is that each skull had been bashed inward in a manner that would allow the brain to be taken out. Since there were no bodies, only heads, and taking into consideration other evidence of the site, the circumstantial evidence seems to agree with this theory of hunters bringing the severed ape heads to the site to extract the brains for food. Yucko.
It was a dinosaur who got sick on the brains and kind of just couldn't handle it and let go of it.
Coughed up the heads?
They're just showing what animals they are.
Yeah. Now, if anything would cause me to question how human these humans were that probably did this, it would be that they're eating brains out of apes. Okay, but anyway. Okay, so again, the question then comes, who or what is that hunter that did this? Weidenreich says it was a hunter that did it. And others are saying who that hunter is. Okay, Steve. After studying all the evidence in great depth, Malcolm Bowden that we quoted earlier, and various other researchers have come to the conclusion that the hunters were human beings, and that Sinanthropus was a variety of ape that they ate. Bowden, here's a quote from Bowden from the film The Origin of Mankind, in which he says this: when these men went out on forays into the forest to find meat, they would kill antelope, deer, and whatever else was there. They would cut out the meat and throw the remains into the fire. Now, if they caught a monkey, monkey's meat is too tough to eat. So they would lop off its head, bring it back, and cook it. When it was cooked, they would smash open the skull and get at the brains, inside which were a delicacy and still are in some parts of the world. Some people eat dogs and cats in some part of the world, and we don't do that here either. No. Okay, going on, Bowden said, then they would toss the broken pieces of the skull on the fire, mixed up with the other animal bones, which is where they were found. And perhaps only several hundred years later, the experts came along and found these bones of apes. They put them together in a reconstruction and claimed that they'd found another missing link, Peking man. Now, Weidenreich did not, he's dead, agree with this hypothesis concerning man as the hunter. Weidenreich, as well as most other evolutionists, concluded that the hunter must be, guess who? Somebody have a guess who the hunter was?
Same creature.
The same creature. He said that the hunter was Sinanthropus himself, hunting his own type. He was both the hunted and the hunter, he said. This hypothesis was necessary and is necessary to preserve the status of Sinanthropus as the evolutionary ancestor of men. As soon as you say man was hunting him, your whole thing goes down the drain. So he concludes that it was Sinanthropus hunting himself. However, Boulay and Valois indicated their doubts as to Weidenreich's point of view in their book Fossil Men. They said this: to this hypothesis, other writers preferred the following, which seemed to them more in conformity with our whole body of knowledge. The hunter was true man, whose stone industry had been found and who preyed upon Sinanthropus. We may therefore ask ourselves whether it is not overbold to consider Sinanthropus the monarch of Chalcutien when he appears in the deposit only in the guise of a mere hunter's prey on a par with the animals by which he is accompanied. In other words, how can he be an ancestor to man, and that's all he is, when man is doing this to him? Now, Weidenreich had an interesting approach to the work which he supervised in Peking. Because of the evidence which legislated against his view and interpretation of Sinanthropus, he had a self-serving philosophy that is summed up in this quote. Now, what I'm going to quote to you would be true. What he says would be true if evolution were true and an absolutely proven fact. If it was, there was no question, no doubt of any kind, and it was just no argument, and everybody knew it was true that man has evolved through the ages from the little ape-like creature to modern man.
God said it in his Bible.
And if God said it in His Word, if that was all known to be true, then what I'm going to read from him would be true. But of course, it's not a proven fact. We believe it didn't happen at all. But I mean, even if you don't have our belief system, even these evolutionists are admitting there's no proof. And therefore, as an evolutionist, he's using circular reasoning in his approach to his work. And here's what he said. In determining the character of a given fossil and its special place in the line of human evolution, only its morphological features should be made the basis of decision. In other words, what it looks like should determine where you put it in the sequence of events. Neither the location of the site where it is recovered, because the location is a problem when they get humans in the same location, right? Nor the geological nature of the layer in which it is embedded is important. So the very thing they try to use other times to support their views, he's saying, oh, no, can't use any of that. You just have to go by what it looks like. And since evolution is true, therefore it fits here, here, and here. Now that's the guy that was in charge of the work there. Some observers that are serious studiers of all this have concluded that the representation of Peking man as a near man is not just misinterpretation, but is an outright fraud. It in fact appears that Peking man was simply an apparently now extinct variety of ape, apparently, once hunted and eaten in China by humans. But a combination of prejudice, preconceived ideas, and a zeal for fame has been responsible for elevating an ape-like creature to the status of an ape-like man. That same combination that produced Peking man about the same general time and including Java Man at the same general time, late 19th century, early 20th century, also produced two other ape men. At least one of these men I know you've heard about. I don't know if you have heard of the other one. But so at this point, we bring in two more characters in the whole scheme, Nebraska Man and Piltdown Man. How many of you have never heard of Piltdown Man? Okay. Piltdown Man is famous. Nebraska Man is less famous. He wasn't even in the encyclopedia. When Duane Gish gets to this discussion in his book of these particular characters I've just mentioned, he entitled that section of his book with the black highlighted title before you get to the paragraphs. He says, "A pig's tooth, an ape's jaw, a dolphin's rib, and a donkey's skull." I'll say that again. A pig's tooth, an ape's jaw, a dolphin's rib, and a donkey's skull. Okay, when we get to these, it becomes even more evident that the skullduggery that goes on the part of these researchers, quote unquote, that they practice is their intent on proving that they're nephews of monkeys. The old expression, "I'll be a monkey's uncle." Well, in this case, they're trying to prove that they aren't the monkeys, but their uncles were. They go to great lengths and absurd lengths to draw conclusions on the evidence. Nebraska Man. Discovered in 1922, he was officially designated Hesperopithecus Harold Cookii. The guy who discovered his name was Harold J. Cook, so they called this Hesperopithecus Harold Cookii. The discovery was comprised of a single tooth, later identified as an extinct pig's tooth. They built an entire man called the Nebraska Man out of them. Before it was discovered that the tooth was from an extinct pig's tooth, various leading evolutionists of the day wrote articles and books featuring Nebraska Man as further proof of human evolution, including G. Elliott Smith. He wrote an article called in the Illustrated London News called "The Ape Man of the Western World." He wrote a book called "The Evolution of Man," in which he featured Nebraska Man. And Harris H. Wilder, these are just some of the people now, by the way, he wrote a book called "The Pedigree of the Human Race," in which he features the Nebraska Man, all based on a pig's tooth. And including another eminent evolutionist, Henry F. Osborne. He also publicized Nebraska Man as a genuine missing link. Let me tell you who he is so you get his pedigree. He lived from 1857 to 1935. He was an evolutionist, a paleontologist specializing in vertebrates, a eugenicist, a student of how to improve the human race through selective breeding, former president of the American Museum of Natural History for 25 years beginning in 1908, former faculty member of Princeton University, founded the Department of Biology at Columbia University, fought against the anti-evolutionism statute of Tennessee, made famous by the Scopes monkey trial. Okay, here's the evidence, the evidence, quote unquote, for a Nebraska Man was used against creationism in the famous Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. Now, for those of you who don't know, in Dayton, Tennessee in 1924 or 25, I've forgotten exactly which year it was, there was a school teacher, there was a law against teaching evolution in the schools. It was against the law to teach evolution. So he believed in evolution, and he got together with some other people who wanted to challenge the law and whether it was valid or not. So he deliberately taught evolution and deliberately got himself charged with the crime of breaking the law of teaching evolution so they could take it to court and argue their case and try to get it to go to the Supreme Court and have it overruled as an invalid law. And so there was the issue as to whether he was guilty or not was never a part of the case. He didn't plead innocent as such. I think he might have pleaded innocent so they could have a trial, but he wasn't claiming that he didn't teach evolution. He admitted he taught evolution. And that was what all the trial was about, actually, as far as the legal aspects. Did he or didn't he do it? And he was convicted of teaching evolution. But what it was really about was bringing creationism versus evolution up into the news media in the forefront and make a mockery out of creation, because in those days creationists believed creation simply because the Bible said so. And they didn't have much, if any, scientific knowledge or basis for defending themselves in the scientific realm as far as creation was concerned. So in the trial, lawyer and evolutionist Clarence Darrow, who was the defense attorney for the school teacher and who was arguing in favor of evolution, exhibited a picture of Nebraska man during the trial and said to Williams Jennings Bryan, the prosecuting attorney, who was a Christian and a creationist, he said, quote, "See, Bryan, even your own state of Nebraska has a fossil that shows there are missing links and that evolution is viable." And the world bought it, even though it was all based on what? A pig's tooth. A vivid reconstruction of this man was commissioned based on the only evidence that existed, the single tooth found in Nebraska, plus a few supposed tools. But later excavations uncovered the rest of the remains that the tooth came from, and the tooth was not that of an animal like man or even of an ape, but it was actually a type of wild pig, originally itself thought to be an extinct peccary, which is a kind of pig, but since 1972 has been known to be alive on this earth, but though it lives only in Paraguay.
Ah,
Yeah.
That where they got that saying, "I'll be a pig's tooth"?
I haven't heard that saying, "I'll be a pig's tooth." Okay. I don't know where they got that saying. If it came from that, I wouldn't be surprised. Now, Duane Gish, concerning all this, said, "I believe this is a case in which a scientist made a man out of a pig, and the pig made a monkey out of the scientist." That's what Duane Gish said about that. Okay, as you can tell by the timer having gone off, we're out of time. I'm almost done, actually, with this the quote-unquote caveman, fossil men, etc. We'll be able to finish this next week. But in fact, I'm just going to break at this point because we're now shifting to the next Nebraska man type character, the Piltdown man. Well, since I haven't got time to cover that completely, I'll go ahead and wait and do that one next week. We'll talk about the Piltdown man next week. I'll just tell you this. All scientists everywhere totally admitted that the Piltdown man was a fraud.
You mean Nebraska or Piltdown?
No. Well, eventually everybody acknowledged the Nebraska man too, but the Piltdown man was famous for like 40 years and was used all over the place. And finally, everybody acknowledged it was a complete and total fraud. I'll tell you that much about it now. We'll look at the details about that next week. Actually, the World Book Encyclopedia, bald-faced admits in their article on it that it was all a fraud, the Piltdown man. But for 40 years, it was used as proof and evidence of the absolute fact of human evolution.
Ron, isn't it true that some of these things that were proved to be fraud like that are still used in schools?
That is, some of them are. I don't know that the Piltdown man is being used like that because that was so blatant, and in fact, it was uncovered by evolutionists themselves. And then they took credit for uncovering it and say, "Oh, look, see how great we are? We uncovered the fact that it was a fraud." But we'll look at that next week.
So it's not too fraudulent.
If it's not too fraudulent, it's okay. Though this was very fraudulent. We're not even talking in the Piltdown man about misinterpreting a tooth. We're talking about filing teeth and bringing in things that just don't have anything to do with each other and pretending. We'll look at that next week. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we do thank and praise you for this time we've had together again to look at these matters. Father, I just pray that all of us will be able to get by some of the more boring aspects of these endless quotes that are necessary to establish the real truth concerning these lies and these portraits that have been painted for us for so long by the evolutionists in every realm, in school and every place else. We just pray, Lord, that you would just keep our minds alert to the truth of these matters and that we wouldn't be bogged down by the many details, and that we would just be encouraged to know that there is simply no evidence, not even something that could be actually misinterpreted by any of us to be evidence against creation. We thank you, Lord, that there is simply no evidence for their view and abundant evidence for the truth of your word, which, of course, we would expect. We thank you for what you've shown us. Pray that you